Hi, it's Liz Nedden. Let's have a look at clusters when we're talking about relationship investigations. So what we've got here is a kiwi bird investigation, and we're looking at the height and the weight to see if there's a relationship between them. Now you can see from this graph here, it looks like there might be a possible kind of grouping going on there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a graph, the same graph, but I've now coloured it in, and I've coloured it in by species type. And so this allows us to see the clusters much more clearly. So I can see that all the red dots, they form our great spotted kiwis. And then we've got these other mixture of green and blue dots, which are both the North Island brown and the southern Tokiwika kiwi birds. So this is what a cluster is. And so if I just go back to the original graph, it kind of gives you a vague idea that we might have some clustering going on here. And it's not until we actually look at it by a categorical variable that we can actually identify there really is some clusters going on. So what we want to do next is we want to be able to write and interpret that up. So the first thing I want to identify is that, well, there's two clusters on this graph between the height and the weight of kiwi birds. So then I need to describe what the two clusters are, and I need to be able to distinguish between the two. So I've got one of those clusters is our great spotted kiwis. And then I need to identify what's different about them. And we can see that they tend to be much taller, but have similar kinds of weights to the other species. And then the second group, which is my North Island brown and southern Tokiwika, they form the second cluster. And both of those species have quite similar weights and heights as each other, which tends to be a little bit lower than the great spotted kiwis. So that's one example of clustering. Here is looking at some rugby data, so top rugby players, and looking at the relationship between the height and the weight of the sample of rugby players. So when I look at this graph, I absolutely can't see any clustering potentially going on. And it's not until I look at the graph and colour code it by what position they play, now I can start to identify that actually maybe there's two separate patterns going on here. So I'm going to highlight those. So I've got the one pattern at the top. So those are looking at the forward players, and we can see they tend to be way more and possibly tend to be a little bit taller than the others. And then we've got our group of backs there, and they tend to be weigh a little bit less and be a little bit shorter typically. So notice I'm using the word tends because not all of them are bigger or smaller than the others. So now we want to write that up. So we want to identify that there are two clusters on this graph between the height and the weight of rugby players. And then I need to identify that one of those clusters is our forwards, and one of them is our backs. And what I've done there is I've highlighted the bit where I've said the second cluster tend to have lower weights and heights. So it's a tendency, it's not an absolute. It's not that all of them are. So that's what we want to do to look at clustering. And clustering is not always going to be present. So be quite careful with this one. It often won't be present, but occasionally it will come through. Thanks for watching.